And it's really in that extension capacity that I became involved in the forest carbon question. I'm going to be talking mostly today from a recent publication that I did with a colleague, Tony D'Amato from the University of Vermont, so I want to acknowledge him. I also want to acknowledge some partners, the Northeast Climate Science Adaptation Center and the NIACS for their support, and some funding from the Renewable Resources Extension Act that helped supply the printing for this. So I'm going to largely be talking from our new publication, Forest Carbon, Essential Natural Solution for Climate Change. My hope today is to be able to provide you with some basics in a grounding in forests and carbon, and how carbon moves within forests and changes over time, as what I hope will be a foundation for then some strategies that you might be able to employ that Todd will build on later in his presentation. Two items or two definitions that I have seen people confuse quite often when I'm out working with people in my extension capacity are these concepts of, oh my, carbon storage and carbon sequestration. I'm very sorry. So on the left is carbon storage, and that is the amount of carbon that is retained within a pool within the forest. And the block on the right should say carbon sequestration. I'm highly embarrassed for that. And what carbon sequestration is the process of removing carbon from the atmosphere. So all plants do this, and all plants use carbon dioxide as you know, as a raw material for photosynthesis. So one is storage is where it's located and the carbon that's actually locked up. And carbon sequestration is actually the process of plants, and in many cases, we're particularly interested in trees, removing carbon dioxide from the atmosphere. I start with this not only because it's a point of confusion for people, and obviously for me, since I didn't put carbon sequestration in that box that I should have, but I also mention this because it becomes particularly important as we look at forests and how they develop, because the rate of carbon sequestration peaks at a different point in forest development than storage. So it's particularly important to differentiate these definitions and understand how they change over time in a forest. And I'll get to that in a couple slides. I use this term carbon pool and want to just be able to define that. Carbon exists within a number of different places within our forests, ranging from carbon that we see most obviously in the live above ground, but there are also carbon stored in live below ground, primarily roots. Carbon is stored in dead wood, both standing trees as well as down dead logs. We have carbon in our litter layer, and of course we have carbon stored in our pool, in our soil pool, which is actually one of the largest pools within the forest. So carbon pools store carbon in each of these places, and the amount of carbon can actually change over time. So each of these carbon pools can both increase and decrease in carbon over time, and we can influence that with our decisions. Just some information from the U.S. Forest Service FIA. Not only does carbon exist in different places in the forest, and that changes over time, but different forest types have different amounts of carbon within them. So I've just put up some pie charts of 4 different forest types that are very common within the Northeast, and you can see that different forest types have different proportions of carbon within their pools. But one thing I do want you to pick out is that dark green and that other green are the soil organic and live above ground. Despite some changes and some differences within these various carbon pools, the 2 carbon pools that hold the most carbon within our forests are the soil organic and that live above ground pool. So those are things to keep an eye on. And as we think about strategies in terms of maintaining carbon or increasing carbon in our forests over time, those are 2 pools to keep an eye on. So like many forest benefits, the benefits we receive from our forests change over time. And that's largely a function of the species and the structure of those forests, and carbon is no different. So just as we see different wildlife species using seedling sapling forests, then we see using large saw timber forests. And just as we have different timber values when in sapling forests versus saw timber, we have different carbon values, or it peaks, carbon peaks differently in different parts of forest development. So here's an image that we developed, forest succession and development as a clock. And if you can take a look, the number of years or the age of the forest, and if you look at that yellow band, for all you foresters out there, this will be very logical. We see different species coming into our forest at different times based on their shade tolerance. So we see at time 0, or let's call it an abandoned pasture, those trees that are most competitive really like sunshine, and they've adapted to grow fast in those conditions. As the forest develops, shade mid-tolerant trees are most competitive, and then of course, over time, shade-tolerant trees become most competitive, and we see that change over time. Likewise, in the green band, we see carbon sequestration change over time. So in our seedling and sapling and pole timber, when stands are developing and we've got this very intense competition, we start seeing carbon sequestration, again, remember the process of carbon dioxide being removed, peaking out somewhere at about 20 years to about 50 to 70 years. So we get, and again, importantly, this is at the stand level or at the per acre level. This is not at the tree level, and that's another common misconception I hear people batting around. But if we're talking about forests, we're talking about the per acre or the stand level, carbon sequestration peaks and leaf area peaks at this time of great competition between 20 and say 50 years up to 70 years. So that's when we see a peak. Now, carbon sequestration doesn't end, trees continue to grow, obviously, but the rate at which forests sequester carbon changes over time, slows down a little bit once they get more mature at, say, 70 years old, and then they, maintain a fairly constant amount of sequestration from there. The brown band is storage. We see something totally different there. Instead of seeing it peak earlier, 20 to 70, carbon storage actually over time just continues to increase. So we see trees getting larger. We see more wood contributed to the litter layer, more organic matter contributed to the litter layer. We see more trees dying. We see more down dead logs, etc. So over time, the older the forest gets, the more carbon it stores. And again, that's the important differentiation between sequestration and storage. And that's important to remember as we move forward. So that's sort of a quick 101 basics on forest and carbon. I want to talk about a couple of decisions that can influence that forest carbon over time. And two of the big ones are forest use of the land and forest management. So this first decision point of whether or not forests get passed on whole is the largest decision point and most impactful decision point that landowners and we as resource managers, resource managers and land trust folks can help control. So landowners that maintain their forests as forests are contributing greatly to both sequestration and storage. And it's really when we see this forest conversion that we lose forest cover that we see the biggest impact on forest carbon. Oftentimes we're moving the live above ground, dead wood and litter layer, whether it's for solar panels, whether it's for houses, whether it's for pasture. Oftentimes, it can also affect the soil carbon pool, whether it's stumping or grading or plowing, it can decrease that as well. Oftentimes these losses are permanent or at least long-term, right? When houses get built, typically they last for at least decades, if not more. Solar panel contracts are typically on the order of magnitude of decades. So when we're talking about forest carbon, and I know most of the people here are most interested in forest management, but I think it's incredibly important for us all to keep in mind that the first step to maintaining and mitigating climate change is keeping forests as forests, and we all have a role to play in that. And I know we're here today focusing on forest carbon, but I also think it's dangerous to put all our eggs in one basket. Let's all remember that when we lose forests, it's not just forest carbon sequestration and storage we lose, but it's also all those many other benefits that we seek to receive from forests as well. So let's move more now to forest management. That's certainly a second decision point that landowners and forest managers can influence. And there are two really broad categories that we can talk about. I'm going to talk primarily about the passive approach, and Todd will move more into the active, but they're both equally important. They both have trade-offs to consider when we're talking about forest carbon. So a passive approach, of course, is letting nature take its course, not doing any timber harvesting, just because there's not extractive management going on. In other words, trees aren't being cut and skidded out of the woods, doesn't mean that it necessarily has to be inactive management fully, that we can work on things like invasive plant control to maintain resiliency of that system, but largely in a passive approach. We're not harvesting timber. This type of approach will likely maximize carbon storage. And please remember our succession and development clock, that over time, just more and more carbon adds up in these pools, and this approach will continue sequestration over time. If this is an approach that's of interest to you, then prioritizing rich sites, productive sites where we can grow really big trees, we can grow more biomass, we can really store lots of carbon are very important sites to prioritize. Looking at sites that are protected, maybe cove sites, areas that may have low disturbance rates because we don't want to lose carbon to some large disturbance, would be places to prioritize over time. There are some important trade-offs to consider with a passive approach. Like I said, it will likely maximize carbon storage, but there are a couple things we need to consider. The first is what I mentioned the last slide, forest resiliency. The graph on the right shows the amount of saw timber in our forests, and that's increasing, as you know from our land use history. So we're getting lots of trees, or we have lots of trees that are similar species, similar ages, similar structures, and we know that disturbances impact different kinds of trees and different canopy positions over time. So we could be setting ourselves up for forests that are less resilient. So depending on your site, whether it's on an exposed site or not, depending on the composition of your forest, does it have a lot of ash, does it have a lot of hemlock, a lot of species that are known to have some forest health issues, whether its structure is largely even aged, might suggest that there are opportunities through silviculture to increase resiliency, which will temporarily reduce storage, but could help the forest over the long term avoid a really large carbon loss through some large disturbance. Another trade-off we have to consider with the passive approach is species in decline. We know that there are a number of species that rely on seedling and young forest habitat, and we need to make a decision, or a landowner needs to make a decision, if the landowner is willing to maximize storage and not provide that kind of habitat, and whether or not we as a society are going to rate carbon storage higher than maintaining these native species. That's a trade-off. And of course, wood products. If we're not harvesting wood here, then where are we harvesting? What are their environmental laws? What are we substituting by not using wood? What are the costs of bringing the wood over here, et cetera? So that's a whole other world, but it's one very important to consider. So there are some trade-offs for this approach, even though it does maximize storage. When we look at active forest management, and I'm going to let Todd focus on the strategies, but when we look at the pools that active forest management can impact, the primary pools are live above ground, right? We're cutting trees, we're harvesting trees. And so the impact of that depends largely on how much you remove. There is also an impact to the litter pools. So we see a 20 to 36, based on research, we see about a 20 to 36% reduction in litter pools by increased decomposition over time. So we do see some impacts on those pools. And of course, when we talk about that soil pool, carbon pool, which is, again, one of the largest pools in our forests, BMPs have been shown to be effective to eliminate the impact of those soil carbon pools. We have to be very careful, though, about implementing those BMPs. That becomes important. So there are strategies that we can use to temper those impacts. I also want to be clear that there are trade-offs to the active approach. We are reducing the site's maximum capacity for storage when we remove logs from the forest. So there is, a temporary reduction in storage of the forest. We, depending on how far you set the succession and development clock back, could be increasing the carbon sequestration by getting that back to a 20 to 50-year-old forest. So there's an opportunity there, but we need to be clear that through active forest management, we are also reducing some of that storage. What happens to those wood products wood when it leaves and so forth is an important consideration, as I said, in the trade-offs. But from an in-forest carbon perspective, we are reducing that. I do like to show this when I have this conversation because I think so often, for good reason, in part because we're trained as foresters to focus on the stand level, and in part because we're often making decisions at the stand and property level, that we focus in on carbon loss at the stand level. But I do think it's important to look at some of this data from the FIA that takes a look at removals to growth ratios over the last 5 or so years in New England. You can take a look at your own state or take a look at the New England average. But in general, for every cubic foot of wood removed, we're growing more wood. So if you're in Connecticut and you're removing a cubic foot of wood, you're growing actually 6.1 cubic feet. So in general, despite harvesting, our forests do continue to aggregate and we are growing more carbon than we're using. And that doesn't even take into consideration new strategies that we can employ that Todd's going to mention to help us maintain more carbon on site. I guess one of the last things I just want to end with is part of at least the heated debate in Massachusetts, and I've seen in other places, is this conversation about, do we take a passive approach or an active approach? And I just want to suggest to you that it doesn't have to be one or the other. In fact, we need both approaches. As you can see, that maximizing sequestration happens at one point, maximizing storage happens at another. So I guess I would encourage you to consider both approaches, and we need it at multiple scales, right? So you could do, if you're a land trust or a state agency that owns multiple properties, you could designate some of those properties as reserves and just allow that carbon to aggregate and maximize storage. You could, if you're managing one property, you could do the same thing within a property. You could designate one stand as a reserve and manage the others. And you can even do this within a stand itself. You can leave large retention trees, and these big dominant and co-dominant trees really do play a disproportionate role in terms of carbon on this forest. So we can do this at multiple scales. I would encourage you to consider, we need both approaches and how best to do that. And really that's a review of each individual parcel to determine its characteristics for resiliency and its site and your goals and so forth. But it doesn't have to be all or one. In fact, we need both. So a couple take homes. I would encourage you to those of you that are landowners or those of you that work with landowners to really keep our eye on the ball here. That I know we immediately, as natural resource professionals, oftentimes jump into the management piece of this, but encouraging landowners to conserve their land, to engage in conservation-based estate planning is critical. It's the first important line that we need to do in terms of stabilizing our carbon and having an influence in New England. That we need to consider these carbon trade-offs. I wish there was an easy button to hit, but there's not. There are trade-offs, and that could be an individual landowner that needs to make that decisions. It can be made at different scales, but looking at those trade-offs and making some hard decisions is important. And then again, remember those two important pools. Soil and above ground are areas that we as natural resource managers can influence and try to mitigate, if we are going to engage in active management, the impacts to carbon. For those of you that would like a free copy, or if you want multiple copies to hand out or mail out, please email me. If you just want to download a PDF, you can go to masswoods.org/carbon and you can download one there. So with that, if there are any clarifying questions, I'd be happy to do that, or we can just hand it over to Todd.
I think we can probably hand it over to Todd. We have some interest in talking about management and what that means. So I think, Todd, if you want to get started, we'll save some of the discussion for after Todd's presentation.
All right, great. There we go. Had to unmute myself, and I'm just going to get my screen up, my slides up here. All right. So thanks for that introduction, Paul. I'm going to really build off of a lot of what Paul just described so well in his introduction here. My name is Todd Ontl, and I am a forest ecologist and the Northern Forest Climate Hub Fellow for the Northern Institute of Applied Climate Science and the Forest Service. And I'm going to talk about the Forest Carbon Management Menu, which is a resource that our group has recently developed and published to help foresters and land managers think about managing for forest carbon, keeping climate change and climate change impacts and vulnerabilities in mind. All right. Come on. My computer is a little slow here with the slide advance. Okay, there we go. So as you all know, forests are really important for carbon. And here's just putting some numbers on some of those definitions that Paul provided with carbon stocks and carbon sequestration. So carbon sequestration rates in forests in the US are average about 11 to 15% of our total CO2 emissions from burning fossil fuels. Those are numbers that sort of vary depending upon the year and come from the EPA. Those sequestration numbers, importantly, are about 90% of our ability to sequester carbon in the land sector. So you know, as we know, forests are really important for sequestering carbon, and they also maintain really high carbon stocks. So about 68% of the carbon on the land surface in the U.S. is maintained in forests. So really important both on the carbon stocks and sequestration side of things. This figure is showing some of the recent work on natural climate solutions that was published by Joe Fargione last year with Joe Fargione with the Nature Conservancy. They did an analysis looking at what the climate mitigation potential is across natural and working lands. And you can see at the very top of this figure that forests have kind of that biggest chunk of the climate mitigation potential. In just two practices being shown here, reforestation, and which is essentially increasing stocking on understocked forest lands. So forest lands that have less than 25% of stocking, and then natural forest management. And this, with this analysis, they focused really on looking at the mitigation potential of extended rotations, particularly on conifer plantations or conifer stands. So huge potential here. Active management has can really be a big part of our kind of overall climate mitigation strategy. We also know, though, that despite the importance or in light of the importance of forests for carbon, that a changing climate and all those risks and stressors from extreme precipitation to forest pests, rising temperatures, reduced snowpack and shortening winters, all these things have a huge, can have a huge impact on forests and can really impact the carbon that they store and the carbon that they sequester in their continued growth. And so thinking about climate change is really important, I think, when we are considering how we can approach forest carbon management, either with an active or with a passive approach. So looking at this issue, you know, we recognized from the outset, thinking about this, that there was a whole body of literature looking at, you know, ways that we could be managing forests for carbon, and that body of literature was really separate from the body of literature that is out there on climate adaptation in forestry. And so our goal with starting this project was to really merge these two bodies of literature, really look for the overlap between them to identify what are some of these adaptation actions that we could be identifying specifically for managing forests for carbon. And so through that effort, we developed the practitioner's menu of strategies and approaches for forest carbon management. And so this was a project led by our group at NIACS and working very closely with our partners at American Forests. You can find the full menu narrative at our website, forestadaptation.org. And we also just recently had a paper come out in the Journal of Forestry. I think it was last week that it came out on that really describes the development of this menu and its use in 2 case studies. And one of those case studies that's described in this Journal of Forestry paper is the one that we'll be talking about a little bit later on in the webinar with Vermont Audubon. Just a few kind of ideas to keep in mind when thinking about the synergies between climate adaptation and carbon management. You know, as I've talked with folks over the years who have been interested in managing for carbon, they often ask, you know, well, what's the carbon benefit going to look like? How much carbon can I store or sequester on my forest with implementing these practices? That's a tough question to answer because quantification of a lot of these management practices doesn't exist beyond individual studies that are probably very specific to the site conditions, to the stand composition, to the management history, those sorts of things. And so we really encourage people to think about the directionality of the responses. So is there going to be a gain in carbon over time? You know, so in lieu of having a nice little tool that I've kind of imagined there in the bottom left hand of the screen where you can put in your management prescription and see a map of how much carbon you can gain or some nice figures. You know, we don't have that handy dandy tool right now. So I really encourage people to kind of think about these various practices and whether or not we're going to see a gain and very importantly, what is the time frame associated with that increase in carbons? Because there are some practices, things like extended rotations or avoided loss where it's very obvious and immediate what the carbon response is. But as Paul described, there are trade-offs. Oftentimes these management practices result in a loss of carbon from the system when we're doing cutting and removing biomass from the forest. But we all know with good forest management and forest practices that we're managing for regeneration and forest health. And so, you know, there's a time frame associated with gaining carbon back in the system and ultimately if we're thinking about reducing climate change risks, a gain in carbon in the system. And so it's really important to be very intentional about thinking about when and where we're going to see those gains in carbon in the system with these different practices. Very rarely are people thinking just about carbon when they're managing forests with carbon in mind. They're also thinking about all these other things that we're interested in managing carbon for, or forests for, which include, you know, wildlife habitat, recreation, water quality or water quantity, timber production. So when thinking about management practices for carbon, it's really important, I think, to recognize those important co-benefits and really, you know, identify what those no regrets things that we can do that have multiple benefits. And we'll talk more about that in the case study at the end of the webinar. And just to really drive home this point about thinking about climate risks and climate adaptation and kind of finding that overlap with carbon is really important, because ultimately the goal, if we're managing for carbon, is resilient carbon sequestration. We want to be, we don't want to be doing maladaptive things that are going to increase the risk of disturbance or carbon loss in the future. We really want to find that sweet spot where mitigation and adaptation overlap, which is often referred to as joint mitigation and adaptation, or JMA. And just two examples of how people are thinking about integrating climate vulnerability and climate risks to be managing for carbon. In fire-prone forests, we all know that there's this very volatile, literally volatile interaction between drought, insect mortality, and fire. And so thinking about management practices like thinning, obviously that has a reduction of carbon to the system, but with the benefit of reducing risk of catastrophic carbon loss to the system. So although you're removing some carbon from the system, you ultimately have a net gain over the long term because you're reducing that risk of carbon loss from fire. A little closer to home in the Northeast, where we don't worry quite as much about wildfire, but we are oftentimes concerned about declining habitat suitability for a lot of our northern and boreal species. I'm showing here the climate change tree atlas results for red spruce, which on the left you can see has really important to a lot of our northern forests. But those projections are showing, depending upon either the low or high emission scenario on the right, showing really strong decreases in habitat suitability. And so when we think about how to be managing for forests that may, say, have a strong component of red spruce in our stands, we might need to be thinking about what are some active management strategies that we can be employing to kind of recognize the risk of losing carbon if we lose this particular species. I mentioned that this is a menu for those of you who may not be familiar with the menus of adaptation strategies and approaches that NIACS has produced. This is just to kind of give you a very, very brief overview of what these menus look like. They're really intended to provide, to show a rationale for the actions that you're implementing by connecting them to kind of these broader adaptation concepts. So this idea of the concept in the cloud are, thinking about resisting climate change impacts, enhancing resilience in our system, or managing for transition to a better adapted forest. And so kind of taking this idea of these concepts, then we sort of build on with a hierarchical structure in the menu where we have strategies. These are kind of the big picture ideas that are applicable across a broad range of geographies or site conditions. Underneath any given strategy, there's multiple approaches. Those are more specific descriptions of the action. And then finally, it's up to the manager to come up with the actual tactic or the action. And so the forest carbon menu has 7 strategies, which I'm showing here. And just to kind of highlight that, we're really looking to kind of take those adaptation concepts of resistance, resilience, and transition and show how they can result in mitigation benefits, either through protecting carbon stocks, enhancing carbon sequestration, or in some cases with transition, restarting carbon sequestration. I'm going to give you a very, very brief look at what some of the strategies and approaches are before getting into the case study in our remaining time here. So the first strategy, strategy 2, really kind of builds off of those the importance of those ideas of the best management practices that really are geared towards sustaining fundamental ecological functions. So the strategy is sustaining ecological functions. Various approaches under that strategy include, reducing impacts to soils. This might be through, making sure to harvest only on frozen ground or dry summer conditions. Maintaining and restoring hydrology as well as various actions that we can be implementing to improve resistance to forest pests or preventing the establishment of invasives. Strategy 3 focuses on reducing carbon losses from natural disturbance. So a couple of approaches under that: altering forest structure to reduce risks. That's really, where thinning, might come into play to reduce drought mortality. Establishing fuel breaks or restoring or maintaining prescribed fire. To build resilience, strategy 4 focuses on the particular situation when you have disturbance that has occurred. What are some approaches that we can do to recover from that disturbance? So revegetation promptly after disturbance. This might either be, a natural disturbance or from a harvest. Thinking about restoring with future adapted species. Guiding species composition early on, and various actions that we can do to protect those future adapted species, things like protecting from herbivory. Strategy 5 really kind of gets at some of that passive management that Paul described. So prioritizing those low vulnerability sites, places that have, are really productive, where we aren't as concerned about disturbance, or establishing reserves on places that are really important for carbon storage. In this example, I'm showing a forested wetland, which can have really, really high carbon densities. Strategy 6 really focuses on that building resilience piece. There are a whole bunch of actions that we can do to build resilience and retain forest character. Things like retaining legacies. These might either be in downed or dead wood, or in live above ground biomass, so reserve trees. Some of those really big important trees for carbon storage. Disfavoring maladapted species, things that we expect to not do well. Various silvicultural treatments for promoting species or structural diversity. And then finally, strategy 7 really kind of focuses on guiding transition and restarting carbon sequestration. So either introducing or favoring existing genotypes, or introducing species either that may not be present at your site but are in the region, or even taking an assisted migration approach if that meshes with your particular risk tolerance for your site. Also altering forest structure or composition by either converting a conifer plantation to a natural hardwood stand, or by converting from even age to uneven age conditions. So really thinking about a transition from one type of forest to another type of forest to kind of restart that carbon sequestration process. So I'm going to switch gears and hopefully go through this last part quickly. As Amanda mentioned, Steve wasn't able to join us today, unfortunately, but I'm going to try my best to represent Steve and the Forestry for the Birds, and talk about one particular project where Steve and I worked together along with Nancy Patch, Extension Forester for the state of Vermont, to consider management on a Audubon Vermont property, mainly geared towards bird habitat, but also with climate adaptation and carbon in mind. And so you know, we know that carbon, or that forests in the Northeast are very rich in their bird species diversity. A lot of these species are neotropical migrants, like the wood thrush or the black-throated green warbler. I'm not a birder, so I'm really proud of myself for knowing that those are two of the species on the screen there. And so with that in mind, the Audubon Vermont, Vermont Audubon worked with has worked with a number of partners, including the Vermont Agency of Natural Resources, to establish the Foresters for the Birds program, and Steve has been really instrumental in developing this, which provides guidance on silvicultural approaches to manage forests for interior forest bird habitat. And they also really focus on providing some demonstration sites to really show what some of these silvicultural practices look like. Audubon, of course, has done a lot of excellent work, you know, looking at climate change and how the risk that climate change poses for birds in North America, and they recently came out with an update to their Birds and Climate Change report, which you know, really highlights the risk that climate change poses for forest birds. Which of course need different habitat characteristics in forests. Some birds need, you know, closed canopy structure. Some need a lot of down material on the forest floor. And so there's a number of silvicultural techniques that can be employed to manage for interior songbird habitat. And so the Green Mountain Audubon Center is a property that's owned by Vermont Audubon. And it really serves as a demonstration site for the Foresters for the Birds. It has a number of other cool features to it. They have a sugar bush, they have, you know, recreational trails, and this is located in Huntington, Vermont. And so a great place to go visit, and really a great place to think about how can we, you know, be managing for bird habitat with climate change and carbon in mind. So about 10 years ago, Steve and Nancy developed a management plan for the Green Mountain Audubon Center. They implemented a timber sale a few years later on a few stands on the property. And so when we began working with them a little over a year ago to use the forest carbon management menu, it was really geared towards updating this 10-year management plan and thinking about, can we manage for bird habitat and climate adaptation and carbon all together, and really have that situation where we have a win-win-win. So really quickly, some of the management goals for the Audubon Vermont project was, of course, songbird breeding habitat. They were also interested in saw timber quantity and quality. I'm thinking about the understory, particularly because of that bird habitat piece, but also habitat for other wildlife, and controlling invasive plant species and controlling competition of beech, which was, you know, limiting regeneration. And they identified some of the climate change challenges being, you know, the warming winters, reducing snowpack and increasing insect pests, and extreme weather, which was creating, you know, opportunities for non-native invasive plant species to colonize following disturbance, as well as the possibility for causing soil erosion. So just a couple of the adaptation actions that Steve and Nancy identified using the forest carbon management menu. First being they're not going to be applying management across the entire property. So there's a good portion of the Green Mountain Audubon Center where they're just kind of keeping that hands-off approach. So avoiding active management, certainly avoiding conversion to and loss of forest. And so some of the benefits for that, certainly for bird habitat, is that's maintaining the extent and the quality of the forest. The adaptation benefit being that it's maintaining the tree species diversity on the site. And of course, taking that passive approach has obvious carbon benefits for maintaining those existing carbon stocks and sequestration capacity. For the areas where they were applying active management on the property, they identified a number of regeneration treatments, silvicultural prescriptions that included group selection, the creation of gaps, as well as where they were doing some more selective harvesting, retaining snags, and retaining some of the large diameter overstory hemlock that were really important, or are really important on the site for carbon storage. You can see a couple of the approaches from the carbon menu that I identified aligned with those actions. And the benefits then from those actions are, that they're really focused on maintaining the forest health and the habitat quality, increasing the complexity of the forest through enhancing structural diversity and tree species composition diversity. So the adaptation benefits are that improves tree health and vigor, enhancing resilience at the site. And the carbon benefits for doing this are then improving that tree health to maintain long-term carbon stocks, particularly in the trees that are being retained on the site, and to maintain those stocks, and then enhance sequestration rates in the places where they did some removal for regeneration. One, and this will be the last management action, and one place where they really hadn't been thinking about implementing this, but using the menu kind of changed their thinking and allowed them to realize that there were some benefits to doing something a little bit different on the site, was promoting northern red oak. That's a minor component in their forest, but it has the benefit of being a species that is present on the site and has a lot of benefits for being adapted to future conditions. And so, they recognized that this would enhance species diversity on the site, but it also, because it supports a diverse insect population, would enhance a potential food resource for the birds. Climate adaptation benefits being related to promoting a future adapted species, which then again could be enhancing the carbon sequestration in the future at the site. So I realized that was a whirlwind tour of the carbon menu and the case study. So I want to make sure that we have time for questions. I went a little longer than I expected, so I will just turn it over to Amanda for questions.
All right, thank you, Todd, and thank you, Paul. So first off, both of our speakers are able to stay on a little bit longer after 1 o'clock. So if you have more questions that aren't answered by 1, then they're able to stick around for a little bit. So I channeled the questions that have come in a few categories, and I'm sorry we won't be able to address all of them before 1, but I wanted to start first with kind of the landowner lens. So Richard Carbonetti had said, maintaining forests is key. The use of forest management to provide for owners to succeed financially so they can maintain their forest and avoid conversion is key. That consideration is often missed in this discussion on carbon and resilience. And Paul, I'm going to pitch it to you, but first I want to just read his follow-up comment about a complementary publication is the Climate Change and Forestry Handbook published by NIACS as part of the Climate Smart Land Network. So Paul, do you want to comment on Carbo's comment about maintaining forests as forests for landowners?
Yeah. Carbo. Yeah, right. Spot on. Yeah. I mean, I think it's an important piece of the portfolio. And I think it has depending on where you are in New England, it's either the prime piece or a piece of the portfolio. In other words, if you're in southern New England, we know that timber prices and timber harvesting, even at the best and highest silviculture, are likely not keeping up with even property taxes. So it needs to be combined with current use or an easement or an LLC or some other conservation-based tool. I think the more rural you are, the more maybe in general northern New England you are, I think it can be the prime tool. So I think it's an excellent tool. And listen, anything that will keep forests as forests, I'm game for. So thanks for pointing that out.
Great, thank you. Again, in the interest of time, I'm going to just kind of switch tracks quickly. So silviculture, we had several questions that came in on silviculture and carbon. First, we had a question about I think probably Bill Keaton, structural complexity enhancement treatments or late successful forest management. How would you rate those approaches in terms of carbon storage and sequestration? So Todd, I don't know if you want to take a first stab, or Paul's already nodding his head.
Yeah. Go ahead.
Sorry. All right. I was just going to say that. So Tony and I wrote this forest carbon piece, but about 8 or 10 years ago, we wrote a piece called "Restoring Old Growth Characteristics" that used both an active but a passive, but also active strategies to restore old growth structure. And when we started reading the forest carbon piece, we laughed that we should just change the title of the Restoring Old Growth and call it forest carbon, because I do think there are a lot of similarities in the strategies we're talking about now, but also those strategies that can cultivate some of those structures, complexity that we're missing in our forests now relative to old growth forests. I think anytime let's think about this as a spectrum. So I think anytime you're removing something from the forest, you're reducing storage. You have the opportunity to increase sequestration rates by younger trees in a gap or over an acre or tens of acres, depending on the intensity. And I think depending on how intense the forestry is or the active silviculture, you're going to sort of shift those balances. So the more intense the silviculture, the more you're going to reduce storage and the less, but higher potential on the sequestration side. So I think there are a lot of potentials to sort of that restoring the old growth structure strategy, particularly in terms of the retention of trees, those large dominant, codominant trees, or we would call them legacy trees then, but retention trees now, have a huge impact. So designating those either in single or patches, I think is important. Increasing the structural complexity, focusing on dead wood, all of those add to those pools over time. So I think it fits very well with those that want to do some active management, but still have carbon as a primary goal.
Yeah, I agree with everything, and very well said, Paul. I'll just add to that I didn't emphasize this when describing the carbon menu, but I will say I think there's a good opportunity here to recognize that what's the best practice for carbon management. It really depends upon a lot of different things. Obviously it depends upon the landowner goals, but also depends upon site conditions. And so, the structural complexity enhancement treatments can be a really great tool, a really great approach for managing for carbon, particularly in some situations where maybe there's some low quality trees just because of previous management, maybe, some previous high grading or something like that. You can think about adding carbon to those deadwood pools by just, girdling or dropping trees and leaving them there to provide, those provide carbon storage benefits in dead and down wood. Enhancing wildlife habitat, and then opening up opportunities, potentially for regeneration of more desirable species. So just, depending upon what your situation is, that can be an excellent way to, meet multiple management objectives.
Great, thank you. On the same vein of silviculture, we had a couple of questions related to carbon storage and whole tree harvesting. So how much carbon storage are we losing with whole tree harvesting? And also, how beneficial is it or isn't it to leave roots and stumps in the ground? Either of you can take that.
Well, you want me to take a shot at it, Todd?
Go ahead, go for it.
All right. Well, I was going to say, I don't know of or at least I don't know the number to actually quantify that, but I would say it's very, the more we're leaving for those pools, or the more we're increasing those pools, the better it is for carbon. So I think leaving stumps and roots from both the soil and water quality, but also a carbon perspective, makes tremendous sense. And depending on your utilization or the condition you're trying to create in the forest, I think if you are able to have this timber sale and maintain as much contribution to the litter and soil as possible, whether it be branches or leaves or whatever it might be, that fine coarse weighted debris always helps.
Yep, and I'll just add in that in addition to the benefits for maintaining soil nutrients on site or nutrients on site, that there's can also be some secondary benefits to maintaining slash and treetops on the site, particularly for providing some opportunities for enhanced regeneration. If you've got deer herbivory is a big problem, which it pretty much is across the board in a lot of our forests. So
I guess the last thing I would add to that is maintaining that slash on there can oftentimes be very helpful in terms of soil health, in terms of reducing rutting or compaction. So I guess you get the added benefit of that BMP on that large soil carbon pool too.
Great, thank you. We're actually now just a minute after 1 o'clock. I'm sure that a lot of folks have to jump off, but we do have more questions and we can continue addressing them. I just wanted to point out quickly that in the chat box, I put a link to the SAF certificate of attendance for today's webinar. And if you missed that for some reason, then you can email me and I can send that to you. And also the link to register for more webinars in the series. Thank you, Paul, and thank you, Todd. And thank you, Steve, who's in the throes of the flu right now, for contributing to this webinar, and everybody who's been able to stick around to be part of it. With that, I think we should probably continue with a few questions. But again, a huge thank you to everybody for being part of this. I'm actually going to switch tracks slightly. We had a couple of questions related to habitat edge and carbon. So 2 questions. One is, are there a higher number of edge habitat species than deep forest species? And I don't know if we can answer that without Steve Hagenbuch, but if anyone in the chat box wants to jump in, or if Todd or Paul, if you have a quick answer to that.
No, I'm going to pass on that one.
I am as well. Yeah, I think that would be a great question for Steve.
Yeah. So follow-up related to habitat and edge. Michael asks, strictly in terms of carbon storage and or sequestration, is there a strong benefit from reconnecting a fragmented landscape or preventing fragmentation per se? Or does the geographic proximity of tree stands or woodlands not have an additive effect on carbon? So sort of an edge effect and carbon. Do either of you have a comment on that?
Yeah, well, from a climate adaptation perspective, and of course, I can't think about carbon without thinking about adaptation benefits. They're just inherently linked in my brain. Anytime that we can enhance the connectivity or be preventing fragmentation of our existing forests is going to have really important benefits. Particularly as we think about tree species movement, but also wildlife as well. That connectivity or preventing that fragmentation has really important benefits, and so we want to be thinking about that to the extent that we can, and just because of the benefits for species diversity, for tree composition in our forests.
I would add to that there's an important resiliency advantage to that. I think the more embedded the forests are, the more resilient they're naturally going to be. They're probably exposed to less invasive plants, and may have more opportunity to be more resistant and resilient to disturbances over time. So and of course, the lack of disturbance would mean more carbon storage, more carbon is able to continue to be stored in the forest. So I think, from a resiliency perspective, resilient forests are going to, have large carbon storage and benefits. And so I think there is a carbon benefit.
Certainly.
Great, thanks. I'm going to switch back to sort of the silviculture train of thought. We had a question: is any thinkable forest management, independent of cost, inferior in sequestration to no cutting, even if no cutting leads to stagnation? So I guess maybe if I read that correctly, is it better to do something rather than do nothing? Paul's smiling.
I was trying to work it out. I'm sorry. Well, first of all, I guess the first thing that jumps out to me is forests aren't stagnant. So they'll continue to sequester carbon even if they're old growth forests. So I guess I don't know. I've heard the term benign neglect. I sort of shudder at that. Our forests continue to do wonderful things, even, particularly with carbon storage over time, and they're still sequestering carbon even when they're old. So I think in part it depends on your goals and what trade-offs you're willing to accept. I think if early successional habitat or the resiliency aren't an issue, and you just have a passive approach is what you're interested in, we need all of it across the landscape. And so I think landowners figuring out for themselves what their goals are and what trade-offs they're comfortable with is the right move.
Yeah, and I think about it also from, strictly thinking about a carbon benefits approach. I think about it a lot from a risk management approach. So, on one end of the spectrum, you may you have this like do nothing, leave it, let nature take its course approach, and on the other hand, you may have a very active approach to things. And depending upon where you are in terms of your climate vulnerability, I think really kind of toggles where you might fall along that spectrum. I can imagine a situation where you've got a lot of hemlock, or you've got a lot of ash in a stand, and you've got a pest one county over, and EAB is imminent, and what you do in that stand is really going to be impacted by that scenario. And taking a do nothing approach and let nature take its course may not yield a lot of benefits for your specific management goals in that situation. You might want to be considering taking a more active approach. Maybe EAB isn't a great example, just because there isn't a whole lot that we can do, but certainly that integrating that, what is the risk to losing your carbon in your stand, I think is kind of where that decision point, or at least will affect that decision point.
Great, thank you. So I'm hearing that managing for resiliency sounds like it has long-term carbon benefit. So I'm seeing that from both of you. I just wanted to swing back to the habitat question really quick. Alex Ashby said, my understanding regarding edge habitat is that there are many species that only live in edges, but the straight edges, like the edge of a traditional plantation, don't provide the proper shelter for them. Also, I think these species overlap pretty heavily with young forest species. Also, it's important to remember that edges can be made everywhere, but the species reliant on forest interior habitat are vulnerable to any fragmentation. So that's a good answer to the habitat and fragmentation question. We had another comment that came in. Regarding edge species, most are area sensitive. That is, they do better in larger habitat patches. Many forest interior species also preferentially forage in young forest areas during the fledgling period, so young forest patches provide habitat for forest interior species. And John Scanlon chimes in, relative to edge habitat, try to do so in portions of the landscape that are already fragmented by active agricultural land, power lines, open wetlands, etc. So the right acre at the right time, ideally, is what I'm hearing. Thank you, everybody out there, for chiming in response to the habitat and edge effect questions. gosh, I'm not sure exactly
that's
where to
great.
turn next.
The wisdom of
Yeah.
crowds. I love it.
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, I love that this is part of the climate adaptation community of practice.
Yes.
All right, let's see. Yeah, I think we're getting. Let's see, we're getting some more questions that are coming in. We had a question: do you have thoughts on pre-salvage versus salvage harvest? That's a scary one. Todd, since you were talking about EAB, you want to address that?
Yeah. Well, yeah, it's a contentious, I think it's a contentious topic. I certainly don't make recommendations necessarily on this issue. I think that there certainly is, there certainly can be some benefits to maintaining species and not doing a pre-salvage harvest, just because there's a lot that we don't know. There's some potential for losing some genetic diversity by just going in and taking everything out prior to a pest coming in. And I think that that's something that I would be a little hesitant to do if it were my lands. But at the same time, I understand sort of the economic arguments for harvesting at the kind of the maximum value of the timber. And so kind of depending upon sort of what is driving your decision, those things come into play. Paul, do you have any thoughts on that?
No, I agree. I'm always very cautious about a pre-salvage. We got to balance the economics of it, but that the SLAM approach to EAB doesn't seem to have worked, does it? It's spread like wildfire, across the East. We're seeing it potentially, act a little different in our landscapes, and so I guess we just don't know whether it's beech bark disease or hemlock woolly adelgid. So finding those healthy, vigorous sites where the trees are well adapted, or finding individuals that seem to be resistant and keeping them there just seems keep every widget, and makes a lot of sense to me. So I agree.
Great, keeping every cog.
And thank you. Oh gosh, that was embarrassing. Thanks.
It's all good. I'm seeing some more questions. Just a couple more. One, Stephen Wood made a comment earlier, and that ties to sort of the numbers. Although I'm hearing some of the answers are more about it depends, and it depends on the human side. But here's the Stephen's comment. Seems to me the carbon storage part is pretty straightforward, but the carbon sequestration rate is the real key if we want to reduce carbon in the atmosphere. Seems like there are many things we can do to affect this with forest management. A couple that come to mind are thinnings to increase growth rate and capture mortality, while also, for fuel wood, offset carbon release from fossil fuels. Also wonder whether shorter rotations would actually be better from a purely carbon sequestration rate standpoint. Either of you want to chime in on that?
Yeah, well, I'll chime in on the shorter rotations piece. There's been some interesting modeling work that has shown that shorter rotations, when you have that harvested material going into wood products, and also when you have in particular sites or species that may have increased vulnerability, by shortening the rotation, you can have some carbon benefits over the long term. And so I'm thinking specifically about some work that was done in Canada, where they were looking at jack pine and shortening rotations, 70-year rotations to 50-year rotations, and showing that had carbon benefits when the jack pine, was kind of on sites that were sort of marginal. And so I think the kind of the substitution effects and carbon storage effects of wood products is something that we didn't really delve into here on this webinar, but it's an important consideration. It's an important piece from the carbon perspective, thinking holistically You know, I've been largely presenting on carbon maintained within forest ecosystems, but of course we have to kind of think outside of the box being the forest, and consider all of those other things. And so certainly, you know, biomass and fuel wood substitution can have some benefits, although I recognize that that's also kind of a contentious issue, and there's a lot of debate around that, around biomass as well.
Embedded within Steve's comment, I think, is the assumption that we're trying to maximize sequestration, if I understand that after reading that. And I think it's important to note that we're trying to do both. We need to keep some carbon stored, and that's what, you know, that passive approach is. That's what those, you know, retention trees do, depending on what scale you want to pursue passive, if you in fact want to do passive. But it's not just all about carbon sequestration. It's certainly wonderful to pull carbon dioxide out of the air, and that's certainly a primary goal, along with maintaining the storage. So I don't, there's not a solution that we can, you know, sort of today agree on that we're going to do, you know, everybody everywhere is going to do one thing and that's how we're going to solve the problem. It takes, you know, a number of different strategies across the landscape that are both passive and active to, I think, ultimately meet our goals.
Great. I think that's actually maybe a good note to kind of wind down and end this on. I know we could probably go all day with all the questions that are coming in. But again, what I'm hearing is that this is a really excellent presentation, really, really good information about considerations for forest carbon management and climate adaptation, going from the landowner lens background and, you know, into what we can do. But what I'm really hearing in the solutions is that it is forests are complex, ever-changing ecosystems. So this is a matter of understanding as much as we can and making a decision and sticking with it, and always learning and always applying new information. Thank you, Paul. Thank you, Todd. And virtually thank you to Steve for sharing all the information that you had. And we'll try to make your contact info accessible on the website. And I hope everybody can join us for future webinars. So virtual round of applause for Paul and Todd and for Steve. Thank you so much, you guys.
Thanks for hosting, Amanda.
Yep, thanks, Amanda.
All right, thank you.
Thank you, everyone, for attending.
Thank you.